My irresponsible brother got the $850K family business while I was ignored my entire life, when he destroyed everything and my parents came begging for my help. I let them lose absolutely everything, and now they live in a tiny apartment while I enjoy my success. I'm 34 years old. I work as a financial analyst. I make good money. I have my own house. And I basically did everything you're supposed to do in life, you know? I studied. I graduated. I got a good job. I saved money. I bought a house before I was 30. I did everything right. And yet, or maybe precisely because of that, I ended up being the forgotten son, while my younger brother, Brandon, who literally dropped out of high school and has never held a steady job for more than 6 months, was always the golden child, the one who could never do anything wrong. And look, I know it sounds bitter to say it like that, and I probably am, but after what happened a few months ago, I think I have a right to be a little resentful. Let me tell you the whole story, because I need to get this off my chest, and maybe, I don't know, someone can tell me if I'm crazy or if I'm actually right to feel the way I feel. Let's start at the beginning, I guess. Brandon is 32 now, 2 years younger than me, and, since we were kids, it was always different between the two of us. I was the older brother, the responsible one, the one who got good grades without anyone asking me to. Brandon was the baby, the charmer, the one who could get away with anything with a smile. And don't get me wrong, I loved my brother when we were kids. I really did. But even back then, you could see the difference in how our parents treated us. If I got an A on a test, it was like, "That's good, Christopher, but you could try harder." If Brandon passed a class with a D, it was a celebration. I mean, literal celebration, with ice cream and everything. My mom would say things like, "Oh, it's just that Brandon needs more support. He's different from you." And I swallowed it because, well, I was a kid and I thought that's how things worked. Things got worse in our teenage years. I kept being the good student, participated in extracurricular activities, worked part-time at a grocery store from age 16 to have my own money. Brandon, on the other hand, started getting into trouble. Nothing super serious, you know what I mean? But things like skipping classes, failing subjects, getting caught smoking behind the school, and every time something happened, my parents defended him. My mom especially, she always had an excuse, that the teachers didn't understand him, that he was going through a difficult phase, that he needed to find his path at his own pace. My dad, who had a pretty successful landscaping business, let's say, always said that Brandon just needed to mature, that it would pass. Looking back, I should have seen it coming. But when you're in the middle of it, when it's your family, you kind of normalize things that really aren't normal. When I was like 19, in my second year of college, he was studying finance at a state university, nothing fancy but decent. Brandon dropped out of high school. He just stopped going one day and announced he wasn't going back. I was home that weekend when it happened, and I remember the conversation perfectly. My parents were, obviously, upset at first. But within days, they were already justifying it. That the education system wasn't for everyone, that Brandon was more about learning by doing practical things, that he could work in my dad's business and learn the trade. And that's exactly what he did. Or well, that's what he was supposed to do. In reality, Brandon worked at the business, which meant he showed up when he wanted, did the bare minimum, and kept living at home without paying rent or anything, while my parents paid him like he was a real employee. I, meanwhile, was paying my own student loans working as a waiter on weekends in addition to studying full-time. I never asked my parents for money after I turned 18 because, I don't know. I felt like I had to prove something, that I had to be independent, and they never offered, honestly. With Brandon, it was different. He lived at home for free, ate for free, my parents paid for his cell phone, the insurance on the car they gave him when he turned 2. 1A, 2015. A Honda Civic. Nothing fancy, but a free car is a free car. They lent me like $3,000 for the down payment on my first car when I was 20. And I had to sign a promissory note and pay them back every cent with interest. Yes, with interest. My own dad charged me interest on a family loan. I graduated when I was 23, got my first real job as a junior analyst at a financial firm in the city, like an hour away from where my parents lived. I started making decent money, Not a fortune, but decent for starting out. And the first thing I did was finish paying off my student loans in 2 years instead of the 10-year payment plan, because I hate owing money. Brandon was still at home, still working with my dad, though basically everyone knew he didn't do much. I went to family dinners on Sundays because, well, they're your parents, right? And every time it was the same story. My parents would ask how my job was going with that tone of voice like, "Oh, how nice, son, very interesting," and then spend the rest of dinner talking about Brandon, worrying about Brandon, making plans to help Brandon with whatever he needed that week. When I was 28, I had saved enough for a down payment on a house. Not a mansion, you know what I mean? But a 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood, with a small yard and everything. I was super proud, honestly, because buying a house before 30 isn't easy, especially having done it all by myself. I invited my parents to see it when I moved in, made dinner, had everything ready to show them my achievement. They came, walked through the house in like 10 minutes. My mom said something like, "Oh, how nice, Christopher, very lovely." And then they sat down in my new living room and spent the next hour talking about how Brandon had had a job interview at a construction company, but they hadn't hired him, and how unfair it was because he had so much experience and the HR people couldn't see his potential. I sat there in my own house thinking, seriously? You can't even pretend to be interested for 5 minutes? It was around that time that I started distancing myself. Not in a dramatic way or anything, just, I stopped trying so hard. I stopped going to all the Sunday dinners. Maybe I'd go twice a month instead of every week. I stopped calling as often. I stopped sharing as much of my life because, what for? Every time I mentioned something good that had happened at work, a promotion, a bonus, whatever, the conversation lasted like 3 minutes before they went back to talking about Brandon. And it's not that I wanted them to celebrate everything all the time, but a little recognition would have been nice, you know? Brandon, meanwhile, kept being a mess. In the following years, he got fired from like 3 different jobs, always for the same thing, that he showed up late, that he didn't show up, that he didn't follow instructions. He always went back to my dad's business, where they basically couldn't fire him because he was family. He had a couple of girlfriends who didn't last long, probably because no woman in her right mind wants to be with a 30-year-old guy who lives with his parents and has no ambitions. But my parents always defended him, always had an excuse. It was always someone else's fault or the circumstances, never Brandon's. I, on the other hand, kept building my life. I got another promotion when I was 31. I was saving well. I had a good emergency fund. I was contributing to my retirement, basically doing everything you're supposed to do financially. I dated someone here and there, but nothing serious, mostly because I was focused on my career and building stability. And honestly, I also think that seeing the codependent relationship mess that my parents had with Brandon had made me a bit cautious about the whole family and commitment thing. Like 8 months ago, in March, I think, or maybe early April, I don't remember exactly, my parents called me and asked me to come to dinner that Sunday, that they had something important to talk to me about. I thought, I don't know, that maybe they were going to sell the house and move to something smaller, or that someone was sick, something like that. My dad was like 62 at the time, my mom 60, so it wasn't far-fetched to think they wanted to talk about retirement plans or something like that. I said yes, sure, and I went that Sunday. I arrived and Brandon was there, which wasn't weird because he still lived at home. Yes, at 32 years old. But there was something in the air. A tension or, I don't know. Like when you know something important is going to happen. We ate. The meal was weird, very formal, very quiet. My mom was there nodding. Brandon was smiling in that way that always made me nervous, like when he knew something I didn't know. And then my dad dropped it. They said they'd been thinking a lot about the future, about what would happen to the business when they were gone, and that they'd decided to leave everything to Brandon. Everything. The business, the house, the savings, basically their entire estate. Because, and I quote verbatim, Brandon needs it more than you do. Christopher, you're already well established and Brandon needs this opportunity to finally find his way. I sat there, literally with my fork halfway to my mouth, processing what I'd just heard. It wasn't that I expected to inherit everything. You know what I mean? I'd never been one of those people who plan their life around an inheritance. But this was different. This was telling me directly to my face that after a lifetime of being the responsible son, the one who did everything right, the one who never gave them problems or asked them for anything, I didn't deserve anything because I'd already figured things out on my own. And Brandon, who had been a complete mess for 32 years, deserved everything. Because… what? Because he never learned to be a functional adult? The logic was so twisted I could hardly believe it. I tried to stay calm. I really tried. I asked them if they'd thought about dividing things in a more equitable way, and my mom came at me with how it wasn't about being equitable, it was about being fair, and that the fair thing was to help the one who needed it most. I asked if they'd considered that maybe Brandon needed to learn to fend for himself instead of continuing to be rescued, and my dad told me I was being selfish, that Brandon was my brother, and I should be happy that he was finally going to have a real opportunity to succeed. Brandon just sat there with that smile, not saying anything, just enjoying the moment. I told them I thought it was incredible, and not in a good way, that after a lifetime of favoritism, they were now literally telling me I was worth nothing to them. My mom started crying and saying, "How could I say that? That of course they cared. About me. But that they had to think about the welfare of the whole family." And that's when something broke in me. You know? All that accumulated frustration from years. All those times I swallowed my feelings. All those dinners where I pretended it didn't bother me to be ignored. It all came out. I told them to keep their inheritance, to give it all to Brandon, to do whatever they wanted, but not to count on me for anything anymore. I got up from the table, grabbed my keys, and left. My mom was screaming for me to come back. Not to be dramatic. My dad was quiet, and Brandon, kept smiling. I never contacted them again. I blocked their numbers, didn't respond to emails, basically cut off all communication. And it wasn't easy, honestly, because no matter how toxic the dynamic was, they were my parents, it was my family. But something in me knew that if I didn't set that boundary at that moment, I was going to spend the rest of my life being the invisible son, while Brandon continued to be the center of attention. The first few days were weird. I felt guilty. I wondered if I'd overreacted, but then I'd think about that dinner, about their faces when they told me I didn't deserve anything, and the guilt would turn to anger again. About 2 months passed without me hearing anything from them, which honestly was a relief. I focused on my work, on my things. I started going to the gym more often. Basically tried to move on with my life. And then one day, a Saturday, I was at the grocery store, and I ran into Mike, a guy who'd worked for my dad for years, basically since before I was born. Mike saw me and came over. He looked uncomfortable, and after the usual greetings, he told me, "Hey, I don't know if you've heard, but things at the business are pretty bad." I asked him what he meant, and he told me that my parents had given the business to Brandon like 3 weeks after that dinner, that they'd officially put him in charge of everything, and that Brandon was basically destroying it. That he showed up late or didn't show up, that he was losing clients, that he'd fired 2 good employees because he didn't like them, that he was making terrible financial decisions. Mike told me he was thinking about quitting because he couldn't watch everything go to hell after so many years of work. I'm not going to lie. Part of me felt satisfaction hearing that. Not because I wanted the business to fail, because there were a lot of innocent people working there, but because reality was finally catching up with my parents. They were finally going to see that giving everything to Brandon wasn't helping him. It was enabling him to keep being a mess, but now with bigger consequences. I thanked Mike for telling me and went on with my day. I honestly thought that maybe that would be it, that my parents would learn their lesson and that's it, everyone would move on with their lives. But of course it wasn't that simple. Like a week later, the messages started. First, it was my mom. Text messages from numbers I didn't have, blocked. Numbers from her friends or I don't know where. They said things like, "Christopher, please, we need to talk. It's important. Your dad needs your help." Then emails, lots of emails, from both of them, explaining that the business was having problems, that Brandon was doing his best but needed guidance, that I, with my finance experience, could help, that it was a family responsibility to support each other. I'd read the emails and delete them without responding. I wasn't going to fall for that. Then the relatives started coming. Uncles, cousins, all suddenly super concerned about me and the family. They called me, sent me messages, all with the same story. How could I turn my back on my family in their time of need? That it was my responsibility as the oldest son to help. That Brandon was my brother, and brothers support each other. And what killed me was that no one, not a single person, acknowledged the pattern. Hey, Christopher, maybe you're right to be upset. Maybe your parents went too far. It was all, you're the strong one. You're the responsible one. You have to be the bigger person and forgive and help, like always. The business kept getting worse. I'd find out from Mike, who would message me from time to time to update me. More employees quitting, clients going to the competition, late payments to suppliers. Apparently, Brandon was spending business money on personal things, like he'd bought himself a new truck with company funds. He was going out more and living like he had money when the reality was that everything was falling apart. My parents were desperate. They'd gotten involved in the business again, trying to save what was left, but the damage was already done. And then, like 2 months ago, came the moment I knew would eventually come. A Sunday morning, I was at home relaxing, drinking coffee, watching something on TV, and there was a knock at the door. I opened it and there were my parents. I hadn't seen them in person in like 6 months, and they looked bad. Honestly, my dad had aged 10 years. My mom looked tired and had red eyes like she'd been crying. I asked them what they were doing there, and my dad said, "Christopher, we need to talk. You can't keep ignoring us." I told them I had nothing to talk to them about and tried to close the door, but my mom put her foot in. Literally put her foot in so I couldn't close it, and started begging. That please, I'd listen to them. That the business was going to go bankrupt. That they were going to lose everything. That they needed my help. That Brandon had made mistakes, but everyone makes mistakes. That I had the ability to fix it. I let them in, mostly because I didn't want to make a scene with the neighbors, and we sat in my living room. My dad started talking about the business, about how bad things were, about how they needed to restructure the finances, and that I was the only person they knew with the knowledge to do it. My mom was begging, saying she was sorry, that maybe they'd been too hard on me, that they understood I was hurt, but that family was more important than pride. And I let them talk. I waited for them to finish, and then I asked them something I'd been holding on to for months. I asked them if they really thought this was about pride, if they really didn't see the pattern of a lifetime. I told them, point by point, example by example, every time they'd made me feel invisible, every time they'd put Brandon first no matter what, every time they'd justified his behavior while demanding perfection from me. My mom started crying, saying they hadn't been that bad, that I was exaggerating, but my dad stayed quiet. I think he was finally processing it, you know? All those things he'd normalized for years, seeing them from the outside for the first time. I told them they'd made it crystal clear at that dinner months ago that I didn't matter, that Brandon was all they cared about, and that, now that their decision had resulted in disaster, they came to me, expecting me to save them. I asked them, where was Brandon in all this? Why wasn't he here begging for help? And my mom said something about how Brandon was very stressed, that it had been very hard on him. Of course. I told them to leave, that I respected that they were my parents, but that I wasn't going to help them, that it wasn't my responsibility to fix the mess they'd created by enabling Brandon for decades. My dad finally spoke and told me he was sorry, that I was right, that they'd been unfair to me, that it had always been easier to worry about Brandon because I was so independent, so capable, that they'd taken for granted that I'd be fine without them. And you know what? Maybe it was the most honest apology they'd ever given me in my life, but it was too late. I told them I appreciated the apology, but that my decision was made, that they needed to leave and leave me alone. My mom started screaming that I was being cruel. How could I do this to them? That I was going to regret it. My dad just hung his head and took her away. It's been 2 months since that. I know from Mike that the business ended up closing like 3 weeks ago, that my parents lost a ton of money, that they had to sell the house because they'd taken out a second mortgage to try to save the business and couldn't pay. Now they're living in a small apartment with Brandon, who apparently still won't accept any responsibility for anything. The relatives keep sending me occasional messages saying, I'm a terrible son, but there are fewer and fewer each time. I think people are starting to see the situation more clearly. Do I feel bad for them? Yes, of course I do. I'm not made of stone. They're my parents, and I never wanted them to lose everything. But I also know that if I had intervened, if I had helped them, it would have just been another chapter in the same old story. Me fixing Brandon's problems. My parents learning that there's always a safety net, that no matter how bad things get, Christopher will be there to save them. And then what? Wait for the next crisis? Spend the rest of my life being the backup plan while Brandon continues to be the favorite? I can't live like that. The truth is, I feel more at peace now than I have in years. Yes, sometimes I feel guilty. Sometimes I wonder if I was too harsh. But then I remember that dinner. I remember my whole childhood and adolescence feeling less important, and the peace comes back. I'm focusing on my own life, on building healthy relationships, on defining what family means to me beyond biology. Maybe someday my parents and I can have some kind of relationship, but it'll have to be on my terms, with clear boundaries, and only if they truly understand what they did wrong. For now, I'm okay being alone. It's better to be alone than to feel invisible surrounded by family.